Hi everybody, today's lesson is going to be on the Cold War. Now the Cold War was a conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. Now it is different from other wars that you may have looked at because it is known as a Cold War, where no direct fighting between the two countries really ever took place. The first thing we're going to look at is the two different ideologies of America, who are capitalist, and the Soviet Union, who are communist. Communism is a one-party state. There can only be one party, so people do not vote for who is in power. Capitalism is very different. There can be endless amount of parties and people can vote for whoever they want. The second main difference is profit and work. So in communism, everyone works for the state. Everything that is produced from all of the factories and all of the farms go to the government. It's then up to them to evenly and fairly spread the profits amongst their workers. In capitalism, it's very different. If you wanted to start up a business, you were able to. If I wanted to start up a business, I was able to. And that would mean that all of the profit that I would make would go to me. Very different to what it's like in communism. Another main difference about communism and capitalism is censorship and freedom of speech. In communist countries, quite often, you are not able to criticise the government. In capitalist states, you have a freedom of speech. If you want to criticise something, you are able to. During the Second World War, the United States and the Soviet Union had fought together to defeat the Nazis and the Japanese. Old powers like France and Great Britain, who had huge empires previously, were now not as important as they once were. There were two huge superpowers that came out of the Second World War, the Soviet Union and the United States, and they were going to hold the power for the next few decades. Now, although the United States and the Soviet Union had trusted each other throughout the war, that was mainly due to them having a common enemy in the Nazis. Now this common enemy had been destroyed and now was over. That distrust of each other started to emerge. Capitalist America thought that the Soviet Union was trying to make the world communist. The Soviet Union, who were communist, thought that America were trying to destroy communism. So the Cold War was a conflict through competition, through propaganda, through spies, through different conflicts that did spark up around the world, like the Vietnam War and the Korean War. The tensions mainly came from their mistrust from one another and competition. Who was going to be the biggest superpower following the Second World War? Now, there are two main conferences that happen in 1945 where tensions begin to grow. The first one is in Yalta in February 1945. When the three countries met to discuss the end of the war, most specifically what would happen to Germany following the war, the three men were represented by the three main leaders. So you have Winston Churchill, President Roosevelt for the United States, and Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union. Now, these three men had worked together throughout the Second World War. They knew each other, and to a certain extent, they did trust each other. In July 1945, the three countries meet again in Potsdam, but this time with different representatives. Winston Churchill had been defeated in the election, so was replaced by the Labour leader Clement Attlee. Roosevelt had died and was now replaced with a man called Harry Truman as President of America. Now, Harry Truman was very different to Roosevelt. Not only did he not have the relationship with Stalin as his predecessor, but he was also very anti-communist. And this was very obvious at the meeting in Potsdam. Another very important fact about Potsdam is that Harry Truman, the President of the United States, was fully aware that the United States had successfully tested their very first atomic bomb. the first atomic bomb the world had ever seen. He was now sitting at this conference knowing that America held the most powerful weapon of all time, and therefore he was the most powerful man at that table. When Stalin came to realise this later, he was very angry that Truman hadn't told him about this knowledge. America and the Soviet Union had just fought a war together. The Soviet Union had pushed the Nazis back, or helped push the Nazis back to Germany, and yet Truman hadn't let Stalin know about the knowledge of the atomic bomb. Now, when Stalin and the Soviet Union began to push the Nazis back through Europe, back to Germany, when the Red Army was pushing those Nazis back through those countries, Stalin and the Soviet Union were taking those countries as for protection. Every country they liberated from the Nazis, they then felt that they should become communist and part of the Soviet Union. Now, Stalin saw this as protection. He saw that as security for the Soviet Union, whereas the United States and Great Britain saw it as warmongering. If you have a look at the map, you will see how many countries became communist following the Second World War. Countries like Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary became communist, which really did scare the United States and Britain. Now, what Stalin saw as security and protection for the Soviet Union, Winston Churchill called an Iron Curtain. And he stands up in America, which lots of historians say that actually consolidates the United States and Britain together. He stands up in America and says there is an Iron Curtain descending across Europe. He was vocalizing and verbalizing this separation between this grand alliance that once fought a war together. The United States and Britain in one side against the Soviet Union, who had created these buffer zones to protect themselves. They called it an Iron Curtain. Now, Stalin saw that as a declaration of war. President Truman was very eager to ensure no other European nation would fall communist like the other nations had. Greece and Turkey were very close to economic collapse. Britain had to stop supporting Greece and Turkey because Britain were also struggling economically. So what Truman does is something called the Truman Doctrine, where he pumps a huge amount of money into Greece and Turkey to ensure that they are able to rebuild their economies so that they do not fall to communism. General Marshall goes even further and puts forward something called the Marshall Plan. Now, the Marshall Plan was set up to support other nations in Europe, just like the Truman Doctrine had supported Greece and Turkey. The Marshall Plan was agreed through Congress, and as you can see from the chart, it really did support a huge amount of nations. Now, what we've looked at today are the main differences between the United States and the Soviet Union. Communism versus capitalism. Now, the Cold War lasted for decades following this. We've really only looked at a very snippet of the origins of the Cold War. Now, the Cold War is the reason for lots of things that you will have known about. The space race, who was going to be the first man on the moon? Who's going to be the first person in space? The arms race, who was going to have the most powerful weapon in the world? Also, conflicts like the Korean War and the Vietnam War. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you're all staying home and I hope you're all staying safe. I hope to see you very soon. As always, email me if you have any other problems. Thank you. Bye.